Hello, everybody. Richard Clark again. Um, in the last video, I neglected to express my gratitude to Terry Wood for asking me to do this video series on behalf of the Easy Does It Club in Surrey. Um, Terry Wood, who is sincerely interested in helping people get recovered from addiction, has read both of my books, which is on my left here. The green book is Spiritual Transformation. It's the third edition. And the blue book is the Addiction Recovery Handbook, which is the revised second edition. These books cover in depth the dynamics of addiction. The green book is mostly concerned with understanding a softer and gentler approach to being spiritual, and it isn't necessary to either believe in God or to be strongly religious in order to live a spiritual life. That's explained in the Green Book. And I've got a lot of feedback from people who are deists who agree with some version or belief that there is some kind of a collective power that influences the universe, and it gives them a sincere approach to being spiritual that involves prayer and meditation. The Blue Book is mostly about the persecution that addicts and alcoholics have received at the hands of the temperance movement, society, general religions in general, and politicians over the last 180 years. Talks a lot about the importance of being an agnostic or an atheist in addiction recovery. And as I've said before, in the last 15 or 20 years, what we know is that there's about 350,000 people in North America that have found addiction recovery being agnostics and atheists and not participating in the traditional view presented in Alcoholics Anonymous. And, well, for reasons I won't go into right now, this is sometimes very threatening to people who have religious convictions and are closed-minded about what's required of each individual. But that's another story. So these are my two books that are available on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, and they are both available through the publisher's website, friesenpress.com. Again, my gratitude and thanks from Terry Wood. If you wish to contact Terry Wood, you can do that through the Easy Does It Club website in Surrey, and that's www.easydoesitclub.org. And if you wish to contact me, you can do that through my counseling website, which is www.greenroomlectures.ca. That's three words, greenroomlectures.ca, and it's Richard W. Clark. And on that site, you'll find a lot of information about myself, my attitude towards addiction and recovery, the work I've done. I've been a therapist now 37 years and participated in my own successful recovery from addictions for 42 years now, and information about these books. Anyway, to try and talk about what's happened in addictions from sort of the early 1960s through to the present day is very complicated. It's convoluted, and it seems to come back on itself. It's kind of a circular discussion. And so I'm going to ask you to bear with me and to sort of reflect carefully on what I'm going to tell you, because it's going to sound like I'm going backwards and forwards and then backwards and forwards to explain the whole thing. As I said in one of the earlier videos, one of the things I realized is sort of in the last 15 or 20 years of my research into the two books has been that at some point in time I would think I had it all figured out, and then I would realize there was some other aspect that needed investigation, and so I'd go off and research that, and then I'd think I had it all figured out, and then I'd realize something else that was important, and I'd have to go figure out all that. The Green Book, in its third edition, and I think it's actually the fourth edition, but anyway, the Green Book in its third edition was 17 years in research, and the Blue Book, after all of the research of that, was an additional 2 or 3 years trying to figure out how society, religions, and culture, politicians had persecuted addicts, and why addiction recovery and treatment protocols had a 90 or 95% failure rate. Anyway, so 1939 is sort of the origin of AA. It becomes very successful through the Big Book. The Big Book is trying, through Bill Wilson, is trying to present four things. It's trying to present that there is a certain amount of moral turpitude and sinning to the actual circumstance of drinking from the Protestant temperance movement. It's trying to present the idea that he got from Dr. Silkworth that consumption of alcohol in a certain class of person triggers an allergic reaction to alcohol, and that's the disease component, which itself triggers a mental health component of obsessive compulsive self-destructive behavior. So that's three things. The fourth thing he wanted to present was that there was a specific path to recovery from this, which could be realized by doing the 12 steps. Now, that brings us up to 1953. Alcoholics Anonymous in the first 20 or 25 years was a very exclusive club to sort of white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians that sought forgiveness for their drinking. And women weren't really accepted for the first 4 or 5 years. African Americans, homosexuals, drug addicts were generally excluded. In 1953, we have the birth of Narcotics Anonymous on the west coast of the United States. And what they did was essentially, partly because of the rejection from AA meetings, they decided to rewrite the Big Book, put the concepts of the 12 steps and prayer and God into their own program, and created this thing called Narcotics Anonymous. Now, over the next sort of 10 or 15 years, from 1953 to into the middle and late 60s, what happened was the blurring of the boundaries between drug addiction and alcoholism. The boundaries were becoming blurry and softened for people who were participating in 12-step programs. There were a few people in Alcoholics Anonymous and a few in Narcotics Anonymous that were now starting to explore the idea that either one of them was an addiction, they were just different variations of an addiction, and the rigid rules of exclusion that were evident in the early 1950s, where, we don't want drug addicts at AA meetings, and we don't want alcoholics at Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and all this kind of belligerent exclusion was being softened. And this was progressing slowly but surely. And what happened in the late 60s in the United States specifically, a lot of what I'm going to talk about now is specific to the United States. What happened in the United States in the late 1960s was they started to realize, in the veterans returning from Vietnam, that while they were in country in Vietnam, there was a very, very obvious and heavy consumption of alcohol and drugs. And of course, this was a way that the soldiers in Vietnam, who were confused about why they were there, were trying to cope with the chaos and indecision and criticism and confusion of what was going on in Vietnam. They were also starting to be confused about the reception after they returned to the United States after their tour of duty. While all of that is going on in the United States, we have this birth of, sort of from 1965 on, and especially from 1967 in the Summer of Love in San Francisco, we have this creation of this subculture, which are hippies, a rock and roll subculture, that are freely experimenting with things like psilocybin and magic mushrooms and LSD and marijuana, And there's a very, very specific and obvious defiance to the government of the United States and its militaristic presentation of the war in Vietnam. And of course, as we have all experienced in reading books and newsreels, and for those of us like myself who lived through that, there was an aggressive division of opinion between the hippies and the subculture and the drug users and the rock and roll people and the federal government in the United States, conscription, and the war in Vietnam. As we all know, there were riots and dissension and conflict everywhere. Now, while that's going on, at the same time was the very legitimate expression of the civil rights movement. And we have African Americans nationwide, and especially in the East Coast and in the South of the United States, protesting racial injustice, and they're demonstrating, and they're outspoken in their criticism of racism and segregation, and so the story goes. Now, what this does is this sort of the returning veterans from Vietnam who are in Vietnam were heavily drug and alcohol addicted, and this subculture of rock and roll hippies that are using acid and psilocybin and mushrooms and experimenting with drugs and being defiant to the government. And the African Americans, being supported by a small segment of white people, were very legitimate, seeking civil rights and equality. While all of this is going on, Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, is becoming terrified, believing that the culture of the United States is disintegrating and is probably going to result in a complete failure of government control. And so, in 1973, he creates the Drug Enforcement Administration and specifically grants powers to the law enforcement and the court system that takes away a lot of the civil rights of people who are found to be drug users, which in itself creates all kinds of problems. There's prejudice and persecution and sort of illegal search and seizure. And the Drug Enforcement Administration, in the creation of an entire subculture that are now criminals, like anybody that uses drugs or acid or psilocybin or weed or whatever, anybody that uses drugs is now a criminal. And so you've immediately criminalized a large portion of this subculture. This naturally attached itself to the civil rights movement, where people who were seeking civil rights and relief from prejudice and segregation were kind of lumped into this defiant subculture of bad people who were trying to destroy the United States. All of it was unfounded. But Nixon created this idea that he needed a Drug Enforcement Administration to work specifically towards apprehending and penalizing and putting in prison all of these notorious drug users, which was ridiculously exaggerated in the mind of middle-class America. Now, as far as addiction, now I'm going to change the subject. As far as addiction recovery goes, from 1953 to 1973, there had been this gentle joining of philosophies between Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Narcotics Anonymous was gaining a lot of respectability in the way that it was helping addicts to recover from their drug addiction. What the government didn't want to talk about, this is also going on at the same time. What the government didn't want to talk about was, while soldiers were doing their military service in Vietnam, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, were heavily involved in alcohol and drugs. But when they were returned to the United States, when they went back to society, about 90% of them quit using alcohol and drugs and just returned to being ordinary American citizens. And it was only about 10% of that population of returning soldiers that continued their extravagant use of alcohol and drugs. This was completely ignored. And so, in the mind of people who were in recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous in the late 60s and very early 70s, there was this softening of the boundaries between Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and they were both addictions, and they were both groups of people were addicts, and there was a kind of a raised eyebrow acceptance to the idea that maybe these were the same things, just in different social aspect. As soon as Nixon created the war on drugs, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and granted all of these extravagant and ridiculous search and seizure powers, the confiscation of property, and all the rest of it, as soon as he granted this, what Nixon did was he created a criminal subculture. Now, I'm going to have to back up to 1920. In 1919 and 1918, and in the decades prior, a large portion of the people in the United States drank alcohol. And in 1920, with the passing of Prohibition, instantly made criminals out of all of the people in the United States who drank. At the stroke of a pen, federal legislation created an entire subculture of criminals. So, we have two things going on in 1920, 1921. We have the temperance movement presenting the idea that people who drank were sinners. And we have federal legislation in Prohibition, which specifically declared that if you drank alcohol, you were a criminal and subject to being arrested and fined or whatever. The same thing happened, but towards drug addicts in 1973. You had this entire subculture that were using acid and psilocybin and whatever they were using, smoking weed. You had this entire subculture that were being politically defiant to the war in Vietnam. That got associated with their drug use, which meant they were bad people. And in 1973, by Nixon signing into legislation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, all of these people who were generally between 15 and 30, all of this entire subculture immediately became criminals. Same thing that happened in 1920 to alcoholics. They immediately became criminals by federal legislation because the federal government in 1920 was trying to impose a moral standard of behavior. That's what happened in 1973. Nixon was looking for money. He was looking for a way to generate revenue. He was looking for ways to save what he thought was the inevitable collapse of American culture. And so what he did was, through federal legislation, passed a law that immediately made criminals out of most of the people who were between 15 and 30 years old. Now, that creation of a criminal subculture in 1973, drug addicts and drug users and people who smoked weed or people who occasionally did a little bit of acid, immediately you were a criminal. What that did was it created a kind of a psychological wall between Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. From 1953 to 1973, the acceptance of narcotics, of alcoholics and alcoholics of narcotics was softening. They were coming together. They were understanding this was alcoholism or drug addiction. And in 1973, with the passing of drug laws and the creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration, what we have is instantly Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't want to associate with all those criminals in Narcotics Anonymous or all those criminals who are drug users. Creates another wall. And that's continued to this day. So that dynamic of creating this division in culture has carried on. So from 1973 to the present day, which it's softening now, because in some countries, and certainly in Canada and some states in the United States, they're legalizing marijuana. They're starting to relax the use of psilocybin. There's various things going on. But from 1973 to now, there's always been this very serious division between Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous that was created by the war on drugs. And of course, there's been lots of other videos and books written about the persecution of addicts because of Richard Nixon's paranoia about the drug-using subculture and the war in Vietnam and all the rest of it. So that division between alcoholics and drug addicts and the creation of drug addicts as criminals is difficult to understand because of what I talked about earlier, where the American Medical Association in 1987, legitimately so, I'm not criticizing the American Medical Association, the American Medical Association gets involved in this and creates yet another division in the mind of the uninformed public. The American Medical Association is saying this is a disease, this is an illness, doctors have to be involved, there's psychiatric issues involved in this, and we have this sort of silent moral majority that's poorly informed, and they think that this is a kind of a moral corruption, and if you drink or use drugs, well, you're just kind of disobedient, and you're defiant, and you're rebellious, and you're just a troublemaker, and if you just smarten up and quit drinking, or you'd smarten up and quit using drugs, everything would be just fine. So we have this division between our views of alcoholics and our views of drug addicts because of the criminalization of drug users. And we have this division in the mindset of a lot of people who are not understanding the difference between the temperance movement and this sort of moral turpitude of alcoholism and the American Medical Association's attempt to legitimize this in 1987. There's all kinds of problems that arise from these different sets of circumstances. And of course, because of the influence of the United States, this was picked up in Canada, it's picked up in England, it's picked up in Australia. There's all kinds of stuff that's happening politically throughout the world where society is demonizing addicts as criminals. And they think that alcoholics are just kind of moral failures, and if they just quit being so defiant and smarten up, everything would be better. All of this has to be sorted out. That's the purpose of the Blue Book and the Green Book, to sort this out. As I said in an earlier video, it is imperative, and what we must understand is the political confusion about the demonizing of drug addicts and the confusion between what's a moral illness and what's a medical illness as far as addiction goes. The only way that we can accomplish that is by a sort of a national in Canada or a national in the United States, this kind of national approach to education of everybody so that they understand this dynamic that's permeated our very existence. And I've heard it thousands of times as I've participated in some 12-step programs. I've heard it thousands of times in the way that I work with people who come to me for counseling, and I tried to explain it in the book. That once I help people understand that there is this confusion between moral failure and illness, and I start to explain to them and understand that what happened in 1920 with the criminalization of people who drank and what happened in 1973 with the criminalization of people who use drugs, they can see a parallel and they can understand the confusion. So anyway, thank you for listening this far. In the next video, I'm going to spend some time, I'm going to shift focus. We're done with the history. I'm going to talk a lot about the two different classifications of symptoms of addiction. I'm going to talk about what the definition of addiction is, and I'm going to talk about spiritual principles that I explain in both of my books. I'm going to talk about spiritual principles in such a way that you can understand that addiction recovery is not based on whether or not you believe in God, and it's not based on whether or not you're an atheist or an agnostic. It depends on how you understand the psychology of addiction, and recovery depends upon how you can understand and sort of assimilate in your mind the way that society, religions, and politicians have persecuted addicts, so that you understand that a lot of the shame and the guilt that you feel was imposed upon you by the society that we live in. As I said, it's very complicated, and hopefully the books have explained it. So the next video is understanding addiction and the symptoms, and I'll get around to that in the next day or two. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again.